At exactly 12:47 am, a sealed directive left Prince Edward's private chambers. Its contents would send shockwaves through royal corridors. By sunrise, Camilla's long-anticipated European tour was over, scrubbed from the royal calendar. But even more stunning, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was quietly named as the Crown's representative in her place. What triggered this midnight move, and why did Edward act alone? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with silence, the kind that descends only when something seismic is about to erupt. Those closest to Edward knew he rarely acted impulsively. Yet on this night, the prince, often regarded as the quiet stabilizer of the monarchy, made a move that would redefine the balance of royal power. Hours before the world would know anything, a trusted aide delivered a velvet-lined envelope to a select few within the royal administration. The contents were clear, final, and utterly unanticipated. Camilla's tour was cancelled. No reasons given. No opportunity for rebuttal, just a void where months of preparation had been. But there was more to this act than a simple change of travel plans. Inside the very walls of Buckingham Palace, staff were jolted awake by direct orders issued not from the king but from Edward. Communication channels were rerouted, phones rang in locked offices. And the most telling signal? Charles was completely bypassed. Sources confirm that palace protocol had been tossed aside in favour of a tightly contained circle of authority, and at its centre stood Edward, wielding a power he hadn't used in decades. Hours later, one figure quietly entered Clarence House without press or ceremony, Catherine. Not as a guest, not as a bystander, but as the solution. Why her? And why now? The answer may lie within the red-marked files delivered to Edward mere hours before the cancellation was issued. Witnesses recall the prince's demeanour shifting sharply. After reviewing the documents, his posture stiffened, his tone hardened, and he issued a rare command to clear the room. Those documents, some believe, detailed politically volatile engagements Camilla had scheduled across Brussels and Madrid, engagements which raised eyebrows even within the diplomatic corps. There were whispers of unapproved meetings and soft negotiations with individuals the Crown had long avoided. Was Camilla attempting to carve a legacy independent of the Crown's direction? Or was it something more dangerous, an attempt to redefine who truly held influence in the monarchy's global image? Theories began to swirl, one louder than the rest. Had Edward invoked a rarely used constitutional clause granting him emergency authority over matters of international representation when trust in the sovereign's judgment was compromised? Legal historians remain divided, but one thing was clear. The prince didn't hesitate. He moved with precision and resolve, as if he'd been waiting for a trigger. And then there was Catherine. Seen briefly through the side gates of Clarence House, her presence that night was no coincidence. Sources close to the family suggest she had already been briefed, already prepared. This wasn't a last-minute swap, it was the unveiling of a long-held contingency. Catherine's reputation abroad had grown quietly but steadily, and now it was being fully activated. She walked through the doors not as a substitute, but as a force of restoration. But as the palace scrambled to adjust protocol, one looming question remained. Why was Camilla removed, and why now? Officially branded as a diplomatic goodwill tour, Camilla's European trip was anything but ceremonial. Sources claim she had a covert agenda, one that would challenge the monarchy's balance of power abroad. Was this tour her attempt to build independent legitimacy in Europe? And more importantly, was Edward aware all along? From the very beginning, something about Camilla's upcoming engagements felt off. Unlike previous royal tours, this one operated with an unusual degree of independence. Buckingham's communications office, usually involved in every logistical and narrative detail, had been notably sidelined. Briefings arrived late or not at all, and her itinerary, normally a tightly controlled state secret, until announced was already making quiet rounds in diplomatic circles across the continent. Edward's office, however, had flagged this tour weeks ago, not out of protocol, but out of concern. Someone had gone to great lengths to distance Camilla's travel plans from the usual oversight, raising more than just royal eyebrows. Behind the polished veneer of receptions and cultural visits, sources now claim the Duchess had added several controversial figures to her list of meetings. Individuals known not for their diplomacy, but for their radical views on monarchy, constitutional reforms, and in some cases subtle Republican sentiments. Some were known lobbyists, others had personal ties to European power brokers with long memories and hidden agendas. The whispers inside palace walls weren't just about Camilla stepping out of bounds, they were about her strategically realigning herself on foreign soil, far from the shadow of the crown and dangerously close to reshaping how Europe viewed her relevance. It wasn't just political figures that raised suspicions. Financial trails began to surface. Reports suggest that exclusive donor dinners had been quietly arranged in Vienna and Berlin events, absent from the official royal calendar, but held under the guise of cultural fundraising. Insiders now allege these gatherings were part of a larger initiative to breathe life back into Camilla's line, a subtle campaign to establish her family's independent legacy within the royal framework. One source close to the Royal Accounting Office claims unusual donor contributions were flagged just days before the tour's cancellation, linking back to organizations with interests in redefining the crown's ceremonial figureheads. And that's when MI5 quietly stepped in. Unofficially, they began compiling intel, inconsistencies in messaging, gaps in security reporting, cross-checks of conversations that raised the spectre of foreign influence not in policy, but in perception. Camilla, whether knowingly or not, had entered into a political minefield. She was no longer just touring Europe, she was building a narrative of personal power, and doing so under the royal banner. That, more than anything, may have been the final trigger. The final nail may have arrived when Edward, under the pretense of a heritage diplomacy summit, met privately with a European diplomat tied to one of Camilla's upcoming hosts. What was shared behind closed doors remains sealed, but witnesses say Edward emerged looking grave, his expressions darker than usual. That very night, the cancellation was issued. Camilla's plans were undone before they began. And while Camilla was blindsided, the woman replacing her had been preparing behind the scenes for months. For years, Catherine played the part of the dutiful royal, gracious, silent, unshakable. But within royal circles, a quiet storm had been brewing. Her ascent wasn't sudden, it was strategic. Behind her poised public image was a campaign carefully built to reclaim the crown's credibility. Behind closed doors, Catherine had long since transitioned from ornamental figure to key strategist. Those who paid close attention began noticing the subtle shift. Her name began appearing on briefing rosters for diplomatic sessions previously reserved for senior advisors. While the public still saw her in ceremonial silence, inside the palace, she was speaking up, offering insight, shaping talking points, and aligning foreign messaging with values the monarchy desperately needed to reaffirm. A quiet presence at first, but one that soon commanded the room with graceful precision. Catherine wasn't just preparing for future leadership, she was already leading, piece by piece. Sources reveal she had been undergoing private coaching with retired Commonwealth envoys, diplomatic veterans who understood both tradition and transformation. These sessions were not merely about etiquette. They were strategic, focused on negotiation, international optics, and damage control in a post-Brexit, post-Diana, post-Meghan world. She was sharpening her influence like a blade, readying herself not for rebellion, but for responsibility. Her transformation wasn't accidental, it was methodical. And she wasn't alone. Princess Anne, the monarchy's enduring steel, had taken notice. Alongside Sophie, the Countess of Wessex, they had become Catherine's silent allies. Allies who knew that the survival of the institution now depended on more than nostalgia or pedigree. It needed clarity, continuity, and credibility. They saw in Catherine what the public was only beginning to suspect, a future monarch not by default, but by design. It was no coincidence, then, that handwritten briefing notes later confirmed to be Catherine's were discovered in Edward's confidential folder the night Camilla's tour was cancelled. She wasn't in the background. She was at the core. Her recent trip to Jordan, once seen as merely cultural, took on new meaning in hindsight. Meetings with local royals, unpublicized strategy dinners, a rare solo address, all now viewed as a test run, a trial to prove she could carry the crown's image alone on foreign soil. And she passed. Quietly. Completely. Camilla may have been slated to represent the monarchy, but Catherine had already shown she could embody it. Still, not everyone welcomed the shift. Deep inside the palace, staff loyalty fractured. Two factions emerged. On one side, Camilla loyalists, long-standing aides who had built careers defending her place. On the other, the Windsor reformists, a younger, quieter group who saw Catherine as the monarchy's rebirth. Tension hung in the air. Meetings grew colder. Lines were drawn, not in confrontation, but in silence, side glances, withheld access and coded memos. A storm was gathering. The crown wasn't just evolving, it was being contested from within. But if Catherine's rise was years in the making, Camilla's downfall came like a guillotine drop, and she wasn't going down quietly. Camilla didn't go down without a fight. Within hours of the cancellation, confidential documents were mysteriously leaked to select reporters' emails, memos, even alleged transcripts. But who orchestrated the leak? And was it meant to expose Edward, or to sabotage Catherine's appointment before it began? The floodgates opened just before dawn. Journalists across Europe and the Commonwealth received a simultaneous burst of anonymous emails, each containing a digital cache of documents bearing royal letterheads and urgent language. What was once confined to palace walls was now spilled across newsroom floors, raw, unfiltered and explosive. The files painted a damning portrait, internal discussions, redacted travel schedules, and heavily footnoted strategy proposals that hinted Catherine had long been considered as a permanent replacement for Camilla, not merely a stand-in. The implication was unmistakable. This hadn't been a last-minute substitution. It was a quiet coup, planned in silence and executed with surgical precision. The documents revealed what many feared and few dared to say aloud. Edward had been maneuvering behind the scenes for months. The leak included a draft proposal unsigned, but traced back to Edward's office that outlined a transitional optics campaign aimed at reinforcing Catherine as the face of a modernized crown. While not illegal, it betrayed a chilling truth. Camilla's position had never been as secure as she was led to believe. Trust, once the bedrock of her survival within the royal structure, had evaporated. The crown's inner circle had moved on. She just hadn't been told. Equally curious was the redaction of Catherine's name across multiple classified memos. It wasn't the omission itself that raised alarms, it was the deliberate nature of it. Who removed her name? And why? Was it to protect her from political fallout? Or was it a desperate attempt to distance her from a growing scandal? Either way, the leaks had the intended effect. Overnight, public discourse shifted. Sympathy for Camilla surged, while suspicion crept into Catherine's carefully managed narrative. One former palace insider, requesting anonymity, claimed Camilla had long believed Charles was being manipulated, cut off from key decisions, and surrounded by figures steering his judgment. She said the crown was being pulled from under her, while Charles smiled for the cameras. The source alleged. In a private phone call captured in a now infamous audio snippet, Camilla's voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. "I've been erased," she said, through stifled sobs. And he's letting them do it. Whether the call was recorded intentionally or leaked by someone within her trusted circle remains unclear, but its impact was seismic. An immediate internal investigation followed. Several senior household staff were subjected to intense questioning. Devices were seized. Confidentiality protocols were enforced with martial precision. But the damage was done. Trust within the royal ranks had been shattered. The palace, already divided, now stood on the edge of chaos. Yet even as the leaks threatened to unravel everything, Prince Edward made a rare public statement and stunned the nation. Standing at the edge of a press podium never meant for him, Prince Edward took a breath and shattered decades of royal silence. With cameras rolling, he confirmed the unthinkable. Camilla's tour was no longer sanctioned. Catherine would carry the crown's message forward. The stunned silence from the press corps said it all. No one had expected him to speak. Not here, not now. A scheduled climate summit in Edinburgh had drawn environmental leaders, policymakers, and a few senior royals for ceremonial attendance. But what unfolded before the world was no ordinary appearance. Edward arrived unannounced, flanked by senior palace security and an unfamiliar communications aide. Every royal watcher held their breath. For a man who had spent most of his public life in quiet dedication, what he delivered that day was nothing short of thunder. With a calm voice and eyes that betrayed the weight behind them, Edward declared, "As of this morning, a new direction has been set. The monarchy must evolve in the eyes of the world. That evolution begins now." He never once mentioned Camilla by name. He didn't have to. The message cut through like a blade. Catherine, standing just a step behind him, didn't speak a single word. She didn't need to. Her silence was a statement in itself, poised, present, and immovable. Her very presence at Edward's side said everything about where power was being consolidated and where it was no longer welcome. And more than that, it suggested unity, a carefully curated alliance between the House of Windsor's remaining pillars, one rooted not in titles, but in trust. But the absence that screamed the loudest was Charles. The king, whose voice should have been the only one addressing such a monumental shift, was nowhere to be seen. No official explanation was provided. Rumours immediately exploded across news outlets, some claiming health concerns, others whispering about a personal standoff behind palace doors. What no one denied was the optics. The future was being declared, and Charles wasn't part of the declaration. Edward's words were as cryptic as they were charged. He warned against past mistakes that must not repeat themselves, an unmistakable allusion to the palace's turbulent history, mistakes that had cost them public trust, internal unity, and more than one favoured heir. His tone was not apologetic. It was corrective, resolute. In that moment, Edward wasn't just the quiet brother. He was the enforcer of a reckoning long overdue. The fallout was immediate. By the next day, 3 senior royal aides, long considered loyal to Camilla's inner circle, had resigned. No official reasons were given, but the timing was no coincidence. Edward's words had set a new course, and not everyone was willing to walk it. Inside the palace, loyalty was no longer assumed. It had to be proven. Behind the regal words and ceremonial calm, however, the palace was crumbling into factions and the war lines were being drawn. Within hours, the palace was no longer one institution, it was 2 warring camps. On one side, Edward, Anne, Sophie and Catherine. On the other, Camilla, a fractured Charles, and their dwindling circle of loyalists. Whispers turned into ultimatums. What began as a tour cancellation spiraled into a battle for the monarchy's future. The unity that once held the royal family in a fragile but functional order collapsed almost overnight. In its place rose a quiet civil war, one not of blood, but of allegiance. Princess Anne, long known for her no-nonsense discipline and unwavering loyalty to the institution, stepped forward as the rallying force behind Catherine's camp. She wasn't loud. She didn't grandstand. But with one sharp glance, one silent nod, Anne made it clear. Catherine was the future, and those clinging to the past would be left behind. Sophie followed suit, her presence amplifying the message: stability over sentiment, merit over memory. Inside the palace, Charles's silence became a riddle with no answer. To some, it was a signal of his quiet rebellion, a king wounded by betrayal and retreating into isolation. To others, it was confusion, paralysis in the face of a storm he hadn't seen coming. With Camilla at his side, his once clear authority seemed to blur. Meetings he once chaired were now led by Edward. Decisions once routed through Clarence House were quietly redirected to Kensington, and Charles, once the axis of royal influence, appeared increasingly like a ghost within his own reign. Camilla's loyalists, few but relentless, began to strike back. Leaks to the tabloids painted Catherine as ambitious, cold, even unprepared for the diplomatic weight now resting on her shoulders. Stories were planted. Narratives spun everything from fashion flubs to unverified rumors of tension between her and foreign dignitaries. But nothing stuck. If anything, each attempt to smear her only cemented the perception that she was being attacked because she was winning. Catherine didn't flinch, and neither did the royals standing with her. The palace, sensing the rising stakes, initiated unprecedented security measures. MI6 was quietly brought in not to monitor enemies abroad, but to protect from unrest within. Surveillance was increased around Edward and Catherine, not just because of public exposure, but due to concerns of sabotage from within. It was no longer about protocol. It was about protection. As tensions mounted, internal staff dynamics began to fracture. Longtime aides walked out, citing irreconcilable differences. Others requested reassignment, some refusing to work under Catherine's team, others wanting out of Camilla's. Offices that once bustled with quiet efficiency now simmered with unspoken tension. Schedules were restructured. Access lists were rewritten. Even private entrances began to reflect the new divide. Caught in the middle were Zara and Beatrice, two women bound by blood, yet suspended between loyalties. Each had ties to both sides, and each was quietly pressured to pick a direction. But hesitation came at a cost. In this new order, neutrality wasn't safety, it was surrender, and the longer they waited, the more visible their silence became. But as the royal family fractured within, Europe's diplomatic circles reacted with an urgency no one saw coming. In Berlin, Vienna, and Madrid, diplomats were briefed. Camilla would not be attending. But what happened next defied every expectation. Catherine's arrival was met not with skepticism, but with reverence. From palace receptions to press coverage, a new image of British royalty emerged, poised, principled, and powerful. No one knew what to expect. With Camilla's absence making headlines across Europe, all eyes turned to Catherine, not with anticipation, but with scrutiny. Yet the moment she stepped into diplomatic spaces, the narrative shifted. Gone was the uncertainty. In its place stood a woman who didn't merely fill a vacancy, she embodied something deeper. European leaders, many of whom had grown weary of royal unpredictability, were stunned by Catherine's composure, her ability to listen more than speak, and to connect without compromising stature. She didn't demand attention, she commanded it. In Spain, during what was intended to be a quiet cultural exchange, Catherine delivered a brief, deliberately restrained speech that stunned the room. Its elegance lay in its restraint, its power in its subtlety. Spanish media crowned her with a name that spread like wildfire across global headlines: La Reina Silenciosa, the Silent Queen. A woman who led without shouting, whose dignity spoke louder than declarations. It was a moniker born not from spectacle, but from the rarest of royal traits: restraint, humility, and strategic grace. Meanwhile, Camilla's absence took on a life of its own. Reports from palace insiders suggested that her name was deliberately omitted from two formal state dinners, an act some called symbolic erasure, others called damage control. Whatever the motive, the message was unmistakable. Europe had moved on, and the face they now welcomed was not Camilla's. Catherine's team responded swiftly, restructuring every element of the tour. Locations were chosen with purpose. Meetings were elevated for impact, symbolism mattered, and Catherine was about to master it. A leaked internal memo from Brussels revealed the private thoughts of a senior diplomat, now circulated across foreign offices. It read simply, "For the first time in years, the British Crown has sent us a stabilising force." That line, though never intended for public consumption, became the quote analysts returned to again and again. Catherine wasn't just filling shoes, she was redefining the role itself. Her presence didn't just ease tensions, it inspired confidence. And then came the message from Edward. Quiet, unseen, sent through private channels as Catherine departed Madrid. "You did it," he wrote. "You changed everything." 6 words that carried the weight of a dynasty. Not praise, but confirmation. That what began as a power shift had now become a public reckoning. Catherine was no longer just a representative of the crown, she was the recalibration of its purpose. But just as Catherine's star began to rise, one final twist threatened to pull it all back into darkness. For days, the world waited for a response from King Charles. When it came, it wasn't a speech or a formal address, it was a leaked recording. Caught during a private conversation, Charles's words would shake the monarchy to its core and expose the fragility of everything built in Camilla's name. The voice was unmistakable. Raspy, burdened, and caught in a rare moment of raw honesty. In the background, palace aides could be faintly heard, but Charles's words pierced through with chilling clarity. "I feel cornered by those I trusted most," he said. "They've outgrown me." Edward, Catherine. It's as if I no longer belong to the monarchy I was meant to lead. The leak was devastating not because it revealed strategy, but because it revealed truth. This was no longer a sovereign in control, but a man quietly unraveling. The world didn't just hear a monarch's pain, it heard a father, a husband, and a ruler slipping through the cracks of his own legacy. Camilla, according to insiders, erupted upon hearing the recording. Not because of the betrayal from whoever released it, but because of the content. Charles's veiled admission that his inner circle had eclipsed him was a wound she couldn't dress. Her fury was volcanic, aimed not just at the leaker, but at the implication that the fight was already lost. To her, the recording was not just a moment of weakness, it was a surrender. She confronted Charles in what staff described as a terrifyingly quiet confrontation, one where the silence between them spoke louder than any accusation. The very next morning, Charles collapsed during a closed-door meeting. Paramedics were called. The palace later called it a brief fainting spell, but the footage of security rushing to seal off the room told a different story. Questions swirled. Was it stress, age, or the crushing realization that control had slipped from his hands? The public didn't need an official diagnosis. They had already diagnosed the state of the monarchy. It was no longer his to steer. The whispers in Parliament grew louder. Talks of succession, once taboo, were now swirling through Westminster corridors. Quiet murmurs of abdication, contingency planning, reforms. The crown could no longer ignore the elephant in the throne room. And yet, even as speculations swelled, the people had made up their minds. Public opinion had turned decisively. The leaked recording hadn't stained Catherine's image, it had sanctified it. She was seen not as the cause of Charles's decline, but as the reason the monarchy still had a future at all. Yet in the ashes of broken alliances and emotional revelations, one woman stood stronger than ever, ready to reshape the monarchy for a new era. The dust settled. The headlines faded. But within palace walls, the power shift was undeniable. Catherine was no longer just the Princess of Wales, she was the monarchy's future. As Camilla quietly stepped back, her European tour a ghost of what could have been, Catherine's team began drawing the blueprint for a new royal age. It started with a single announcement. Understated, but seismic, Catherine was officially appointed to lead the Crown's diplomatic initiatives abroad. What had once been Camilla's realm had now been redefined, not just in title but in spirit. Catherine would not represent tradition as it was, but what it could become. The press release was carefully worded, but behind its polished phrasing was a message to every corner of the Commonwealth. The Windsor axis had shifted, and the monarchy was being recast under new, steadier hands. In contrast, Camilla's final public appearance was a scene steeped in quiet sorrow. A low-key charity event, untelevised and tucked away in a quiet London borough, became her swan song. Witnesses noted her tearful farewell, the forced smile that faltered as flashbulbs went off for the last time. Her allies were gone, her influence dissolved. What had begun as a tour to cement her legacy had ended in an exile no one officially declared but everyone recognized. She had not been dethroned, she had been forgotten. Inside the palace, Edward's influence grew, not in ego, but in reach. He was named Strategic Overseer for all future royal representation, a broader title that didn't exist before, but was created because of him. His role was now codified, his judgment cemented. The quiet brother had become the architect of a monarchic reset. And while Charles remained king in name, it was Edward who now moved the board pieces. In a move both symbolic and monumental, Charles granted Catherine full ceremonial authority for the upcoming Commonwealth Day, a privilege typically reserved for reigning monarchs or consorts. For the first time, a Princess of Wales would stand alone, representing not just a nation, but a fractured family trying to find its footing again. Whether it was an act of resignation or redemption, Charles's decision confirmed what many already believed: the crown's future had a new face. Within Buckingham, staff reassignments began to reflect the new reality. Offices were restructured, chains of command redrawn. Those loyal to Catherine were promoted. Others, once tied to Camilla's inner circle, were quietly phased out or moved laterally into ceremonial positions. The power structure wasn't just changed, it was rebuilt. Then came Catherine's first official message to the public, not through a televised address, but a statement released across global embassies. We lead with grace. We serve with strength. 6 words that echoed louder than any throne room decree. A message not of dominance, but of direction. Not a demand for loyalty, but an invitation to believe again. Because in the monarchy, power is never simply given, it is seized in silence, storm, and sacrifice. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.